The opening of Daniel 11 up to verse 4 fairly explicitly matches previous Daniel chapters. The three kings of Persia have various interpretations depending if Cyrus is included or not, but the fourth king is almost universally agreed to be Xerxes, the husband of Esther. The Medo-Persian Empire would fall to Hellenistic Greece, and Alexander the Great would have dominion through his Hellenistic Empire, which would split four ways: a direct interpretation of the four-headed leopard and the four-horned goat of Daniel 7 and 8. None of Alexander's immediate family rose to rule in his stead. His generals tore apart his empire, but kept Greco-Hellenistic culture. Note that Xerxes and Alexander were roughly 150 years apart, thus there's a 150-year gap between verses 2 and 3. Time gaps cause havoc with interpretations of this chapter, leading some commentators to push almost all of it into the future, a future Antichrist, and others to push almost all of it into the past, in the life of Antiochus Epiphanes. After verse 4, Daniel 11 starts to become a little more complex and subtle, but has some quotes and allusions to other chapters that we can use to correlate events. Only biblical correlations can be used to indicate the timelines, as there could be time gaps. Initially, the king of the south would be Ptolemaic Egypt, as confirmed by verse 8, and the king of the north would be Seleucid Assyria. The vast majority of the commentators agree on interpretations up to verse 14, but verse 5 to 15 offer very little in the way of correlations to the rest of the Bible, as they cover the time between the Testaments. This also means the first 22 chapters cover about 500 years, while the remaining 23 verses cover over 2,000 years. The majority of Daniel 11, verses 5 to 39, depict a north-south conflict, but after verse 29, it appears to be all about the king of the north as the Antichrist until verse 40, when the king of the south rises again. In verse 16, we see the glorious land conquered. This would be an allusion to Daniel 8:9, as the Roman Empire continued to encroach on Greco-Hellenistic empires. Some commentators see the Roman Empire introduced as early as verse 14. Verse 14 is where Preterism differs and delves into the kingship of Antiochus Epiphanes. In verse 22, we have a reference to the Prince of the Covenant, which would be the first advent of Christ, as referenced in Daniel 9. And immediately previous, in verse 20, we see a raiser of taxes, which we find in the Gospel of Luke, in verse 2:1, as Caesar Augustus raising taxes. Most commentators see the transition from pagan Rome to the Antichrist occurring in verse 30. A few commentators see the rise of the Antichrist as early as verse 23. Verses 23 to 29 offer little in the way of correlations to the rest of the Bible. In verses 31 to 37, we see direct correlations to the Antichrist power of Daniel 7 and 8. The words "abomination that makes desolate" has allusions to Daniel 9:27, and in the context of the Olivet Discourse, this appears to be part of a blended prophecy, where Christ compares the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD with that of the end of the world, because the apostles asked a twofold question. Thus, something the Antichrist power does is kind of similar to the destruction of Jerusalem. Christ's reference to the abomination of desolation as yet future makes it certain that Antiochus Epiphanes was not the subject of this prophecy. Starting in verse 40, a new time frame is introduced, the time of the end. This appears to be a reference to the start of the judgment as defined by Daniel 8's cleansing of the sanctuary, and in Daniel 7 we see judgment immediately prior to the second coming in Daniel 7. This prophecy continues to Daniel 12, 1-3 with the second coming. Thus, without identifying specific historical events for every aspect of Daniel 11, we know that our present history is sometime after verse 40, as we are sometime after the 2300 days ending in 1844 AD, when the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary began. Many commentators also see a slow shift in the kings, similar to how Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 start out referring to the Prince of Tyre and the King of Babylon, but addresses the power behind the throne. In this interpretation, many commentators suggest that the north in the Bible generally represents Babylon, Assyria, Seleucids, Rome, and then the Antichrist, and thus also false or apostate religion, while the south generally represents Pharaonic Egypt and Ptolemaic Egypt, and thus atheism, for the Pharaoh of the Exodus had stated multiple times, "I do not know the Lord." Thus, the end becomes more of a philosophical war. As atheism pushes against apostate Christianity, the backlash appears to miss the Jews and their kindred, as indicated by Edom, Moab, and Ammon. But the atheists, as Egypt, shall not escape, and Muslims, as Libya and Ethiopia, shall be at his steps. Tidings from the east may be an allusion to Matthew 24:27, which would indicate the imminence of the second coming, and the north might be a rebellion or revolution within the false religion. Verse 45 has some direct allusions to Ezekiel 28, and especially to Isaiah 14, as the Antichrist power epitomizes the devil, and wishes to be God on earth, at which time Michael shall stand up, and a time of trouble, immediately followed by the deliverance of the second coming.